It was only supposed to be a fleeting moment, one of those accidental crossings of paths in a house too big for the few of us left. I didn't expect anything beyond a shared silence in the hallway, a polite smile exchanged in the evening light filtering through the windows. But from the moment Lucas returned home, the air felt different. Charged, almost electric. It wasn't that I meant for things to happen, or even wanted them to. But sometimes, intentions and actions don't align as neatly as they should. I'd been married to Jerome for over 20 years, steady years, if not remarkable ones. Jerome, with his long hours and impeccable suits, was a man of habits, a man of routines. Lucas, though, his energy filled the spaces Jerome left empty, like water pouring into cracks. I told myself it was just my imagination, an illusion born out of loneliness. But then came that day in the storage room. Jerome was away, and Lucas and I were rearranging boxes, small talk filling the silence until a brief brush of his hand against mine stopped me cold. His look lingered a second too long, a charged silence hanging between us. I excused myself, heart pounding, pretending nothing had happened. Yet that was only the beginning. Now, here I stand, staring at the echo of that moment, wondering how I got here. Exiled from my own home, accused of things I can't fully deny. It was an ordinary Tuesday when I realized the space between Lucas and me was closing in, each shared silence stretching longer, each look lingering just a little too long. Jerome, my husband of 22 years, was on one of his business trips, as usual. There were weeks where the only sounds in our house came from the faint ticking of the clock in the hallway and the muted creaks of the floorboards. But then Lucas had returned, bringing with him a silence that felt anything but empty. It wasn't as if we'd spoken much. In fact, it was the opposite. Lucas had a brooding, almost detached way about him, his presence both distant and disarmingly magnetic. He was Jerome's son from a previous marriage, a 28-year-old with a look that could stop you cold if he ever decided to really look at you. But mostly, he kept his gaze averted, his focus on things beyond anyone else's reach. That Tuesday, I was in the kitchen washing up when I sensed him there, standing quietly by the doorframe. I glanced over my shoulder, surprised to see him. His eyes were on me, an unreadable expression darkening his face. "Do you need something, Lucas?" I asked, breaking the silence. He shook his head, and a slow, almost shy smile crept across his face. "Just came down for some water." His voice was soft, nearly inaudible. "Didn't mean to disturb you." Yet, disturb me he had. Something about his tone, his stance, it all left me feeling unbalanced, though I couldn't put my finger on why. I turned back to the sink, trying to dismiss the sensation. But his presence lingered long after he'd left. It was as though he'd carved a shape out of the air itself, one that pressed against my thoughts with a persistent, uncomfortable familiarity. Over the next few days, we seemed to cross paths more often than I'd have thought possible in a house this large. He was always just there, in the hallway as I returned from errands, on the back porch as I watered the plants, even by the laundry room one afternoon when I was folding Jerome's shirts. Each encounter felt like a deliberate accident, an invisible line being tested and redrawn every time we exchanged a look or a word. I found myself studying Lucas in a way I hadn't before, noticing details that I'd never paid attention to. His quiet intensity, the way his fingers moved when he typed on his laptop, the subtle lift of his brow when he was deep in thought. It was all wrong, of course. I was his father's wife. But once a thought like that starts rooting itself, it becomes nearly impossible to tear out. One evening, I passed by the hallway mirror and hardly recognized myself. A woman with graying hair that curled softly at her temples looked back at me, her expression a mixture of curiosity and worry. I had never considered myself a woman prone to flirtation or intrigue, but the distance between Jerome and me had stretched into a chasm over the years. A chasm that seemed to grow wider with every trip he took, every late-night dinner he missed, And there was Lucas, bridging that gap, however subtly, however unintentionally. The weight of that realization hit me harder than I would have liked. The following week, Jerome announced he'd be going out of town again, this time for 4 days. Part of me was relieved. Another part, the one I was too ashamed to acknowledge, felt something else, an anticipation I didn't fully understand. The first day he was gone, I found myself alone in the storage room, trying to make sense of the disarray of boxes we'd accumulated over the years. I'd just reached for a particularly heavy one when I felt a presence behind me. I turned around to see Lucas standing in the doorway, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity I hadn't seen before. "You shouldn't be lifting things like that," he said, stepping closer. I laughed it off, brushing a stray hair from my forehead. "I can manage just fine. These boxes don't scare me." He took the box from me anyway, setting it down with ease. His arm brushed against mine as he moved, and the touch, however brief, sent a shock through me. I could feel my cheeks warming, and I quickly turned away, hoping he wouldn't notice. But he was watching me, a small, knowing smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "You know, you don't have to do this alone," he said quietly. "I can help." There was a pause, a thick, charged silence that settled around us like a blanket. I should have left, should have broken whatever unspoken connection was simmering between us. But I didn't. Instead, I nodded, my heart pounding as we worked side by side, wordlessly, each movement punctuated by the occasional brush of his hand or glance that lingered a moment too long. I felt like I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something I hadn't anticipated or wanted. But once you've felt that spark, it's hard to pretend it isn't there. 2 days later, Jerome was still away, and I had the house to myself. Or so I thought. I just finished a long, hot shower, letting the steam cloud my thoughts as I tried to wash away the sense of guilt that had begun to creep in. Lost in my own head, I left the bathroom door open, thinking I was alone. When I finally turned around, wrapping a towel around myself, I saw Lucas standing in the hallway, his gaze fixed squarely on me. My heart stopped for a beat, and an unfamiliar thrill shot through me, mingled with a sharp spike of panic. I'm sorry," I stammered, pulling the towel tighter around myself. "I thought I was alone." He didn't move, didn't look away, his eyes dark and unreadable. "It's your house," he said, a hint of something in his tone that sent a shiver down my spine. "You don't need to apologize." For a moment, neither of us moved. The tension hung heavy in the air, palpable and unyielding, as though we were both waiting for something, anything, to break the silence. Finally, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, breathless and unnerved. The next day, Jerome returned home early. He seemed distracted, his usual briskness tempered by something I couldn't quite place. I tried to ask him about his trip, but he barely responded, muttering something about work stress, before disappearing into his study. Later that evening, he found me in the kitchen, his expression unreadable as he took a deep breath. "We need to talk." A chill ran down my spine. I put down the glass I was holding and looked at him, feeling a sense of dread I couldn't quite explain. "What's wrong?" He hesitated, then crossed his arms, his gaze cold. "Lucas told me something. He said you made advances on him." The words hit me like a slap. I staggered back, stunned. "What, Jerome, that's not true. I would never." But he cut me off, his face contorted in anger. "I trusted you, Eleanor. I believed you were better than this." His voice was low, filled with a bitterness that shook me to my core. I tried to explain, to find the words to defend myself, but they wouldn't come. The memory of those fleeting moments with Lucas, the touches and glances that had felt innocent at the time, now twisted into something far more sinister. Had I crossed a line without realizing it? Had I let something grow that should have been snuffed out from the start? Jerome didn't wait for an explanation. He told me to leave, to get out of the house and not come back. And as I stood there staring at the man I'd built a life with, I realized that I had no defense, because deep down, I wasn't even sure he was wrong. Standing on the porch, suitcase in hand, I felt the sting of rejection settle into my bones. Jerome's words echoed through my mind, each accusation sharpening the reality of what had just happened. I hadn't even been allowed to pack properly, just a few essentials thrown into a bag, the rest abandoned. I glanced back at the door, half expecting Jerome to come after me, to stop me, to listen. But he didn't. I had nowhere to go, nowhere that felt like mine. Our marriage had been my anchor, and the house, my refuge. Without either, I felt untethered, adrift. I got into the car, staring blankly at the road ahead, fighting back the panic rising in my chest. I'd never been a woman who walked out without a plan, but that day I didn't have the strength to think, let alone plan. After driving aimlessly for hours, I pulled into the parking lot of a small roadside motel on the outskirts of town. The neon sign buzzed faintly, flickering between VAC and ANSI, but I barely noticed. I was exhausted, drained of any energy to keep my thoughts in check. Checking in felt surreal, a step down from the life I'd known. As I lay on the scratchy motel sheets, staring at the peeling wallpaper, the disbelief finally sank into anger. The next morning, my mind was clearer, sharper. I couldn't accept that my entire life had unraveled because of a few accusations from Lucas. I replayed each encounter, dissecting every touch, every look. Had I really encouraged him? Did I somehow give him reason to think I'd been interested? But that uncertainty only fueled my determination. I wasn't going to be humiliated without understanding why he'd done this. I knew Jerome wouldn't believe me. He'd made that painfully clear. But that didn't mean I couldn't figure out the truth for myself. I needed answers, and the only way to get them was to start where it all began, with Lucas's past. Lucas had returned home only a few months prior, a quiet man with a mysterious air. I'd heard Jerome mention his struggles after a failed business in Seattle, but Jerome's explanations were always vague, protective even. Lucas had drifted in and out of the house before, but I'd assumed this time he was back for good. That afternoon, I drove into the city to visit the one person who might have answers, Sylvia, an old friend of Jerome's who worked at a real estate agency and had contacts across town. Sylvia was the kind of woman who knew things about everyone, whether they wanted her to or not. I hadn't seen her in years, but I knew if anyone could give me insight into Lucas's world, it was her. "Eleanor, what a surprise!" Sylvia exclaimed, waving me over to her office. Her gaze was sharp as she took in my worn expression, but she didn't pry. Instead, she leaned back, crossed her arms, and gave me that knowing look she reserved for moments when secrets were about to be spilled. "Sylvia, I need to know about Lucas," I said, skipping any pleasantries. Her eyebrow arched, and for a moment she looked almost amused. "Jerome's son? Quite the enigma, isn't he? Word is, he's had a bit of trouble lately." She paused, glancing at me carefully. "But why do you want to know?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "There's been tension between us. He's caused some trouble for Jerome and me, and I need to know what he's capable of." Sylvia's gaze softened slightly. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Lucas isn't what he seems, Eleanor. He's charming, sure, but he's been in debt for years. Took out loans for that tech startup that flopped, and he hasn't recovered since. He keeps pulling people in, making promises he can't keep. I'd be careful around him." I swallowed, the pieces beginning to align in my mind. Was he manipulative? "More than manipulative," Sylvia said, her tone darkening. "He's ruined lives, Eleanor. Friend of mine got wrapped up in his promises, financially and personally. She lost a lot before she wised up. He's dangerous." The conversation left me shaken. Lucas had seemed lost and vulnerable, a man who just needed guidance. But now I was seeing a different side of him, one carefully hidden beneath the veneer of charm. Had he come back to Jerome simply to gain access to our resources? After leaving Sylvia's office, I sat in my car, processing what I'd learned. I could see how Lucas had played on Jerome's sympathy, spinning tales of hardship, subtly positioning himself as the victim of circumstances. Jerome had always had a blind spot for his son. A weakness Lucas must have known how to exploit. The more I thought about it, the clearer Lucas's motivations became. And yet, another, darker possibility loomed in the back of my mind. Had he deliberately pushed me out to secure his position, to drive a wedge between me and Jerome? The truth gnawed at me, relentless, and I felt an anger building inside. I had been naive, lulled by his facade. The quiet smiles, the shared glances, they hadn't been innocent. They'd been calculated, each one a step toward this moment. And now, here I was, exiled from my own home, left to pick up the pieces of a life I no longer recognized. Determined to get to the bottom of things, I decided to look into Lucas's failed business in Seattle. A quick search on my phone led me to an address for his old business partner, a man named Gavin Lyles. He was an entrepreneur known for his high-stakes investments and even higher-stakes mistakes. If anyone knew the truth behind Lucas's past, it would be Gavin. The next day, I made the drive up to Seattle. It felt strange, seeking out answers this way, almost as though I were preparing for a confrontation. When I arrived at Gavin's office, a young receptionist gave me a curious look before disappearing into a back room. Moments later, a tall man in a crisp suit emerged, his expression guarded. "You're here about Lucas, aren't you?" he asked, his voice clipped. I nodded, not bothering to explain further. Gavin gestured toward a chair. "Take a seat, Mrs. Ward." His tone was polite but distant, as though I were just another business associate. Lucas was talented, I'll give him that, but he was reckless. He burned through every bit of capital we had and then some. I had no choice but to pull out before he dragged us both under. Did he ever? I hesitated, feeling a surge of embarrassment at the question. Did he ever manipulate you? I mean, did he lie about things? A faint smile tugged at Gavin's lips, but it wasn't a pleasant one. That's his specialty. He's a master at twisting the truth, saying exactly what you need to hear to keep you hooked. He did it with me, and he's done it with plenty of others. You're not the first person to be blindsided by Lucas's charm. The conversation confirmed what I'd feared. Lucas hadn't just been unlucky. He was a calculated manipulator, one who knew how to use people to his advantage. I left Gavin's office with a sense of grim determination. Whatever spell Lucas had cast over Jerome, I was going to break it. He had shattered my life, and I wasn't going to let him ruin Jerome's as well. 2 days later, I returned to the city, parking outside the house that had once been mine. A part of me wanted to march in and confront Jerome, to force him to see the truth. But another part of me hesitated, the weight of my accusations feeling heavier than ever. Instead, I decided to try a different approach. If Jerome wouldn't hear the truth from me, perhaps he'd believe it from someone else. I called Sylvia again, asking if she'd be willing to talk to Jerome. She agreed, her tone sympathetic. "Eleanor, you've been through enough," she said. "He deserves to know what kind of person his son really is." That evening, I waited across the street, watching as Sylvia's car pulled into our driveway. She stayed for nearly an hour, and when she finally left, I watched as Jerome stood in the doorway, his posture tense, his expression unreadable. As the door closed, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. The truth was finally out there. Now all I could do was wait and see what Jerome would do with it. When I returned to the motel that night, I found myself unable to sleep. Images of Lucas, his manipulative smile and haunting glances, played through my mind. I tried to imagine how Jerome was feeling, if he'd finally opened his eyes to the truth after Sylvia's visit. I kept replaying our last moments together. Jerome's coldness, his unwillingness to listen, and I couldn't shake the bitterness that had settled in my chest. The next morning, I decided I couldn't just sit back and wait for him to reach out. If Jerome truly knew what Lucas was capable of, he would come looking for me. So I called, each ring a beat of desperation and dread, until his voice, curt and formal, finally answered. "Jerome, it's me," I started, heart racing. He was silent for a moment, the line heavy with tension. "What do you want, Eleanor?" I just... My voice faltered. I hadn't expected his tone to be so harsh, as if I were a stranger. "Did you talk to Sylvia?" A sigh escaped him. "I did. She had some interesting things to say." A flicker of hope ignited in me. "So you believe me?" "I didn't say that," he cut in, his voice laced with skepticism. "What I believe, Eleanor, is that there's a lot more going on here than you're telling me." I felt the ground shift beneath me. "Jerome, I've told you the truth. Lucas manipulated you. Manipulated us. He's lying. He's always been lying." Jerome's silence stretched out, cold and impenetrable. "I'll talk to Lucas myself," he said finally, his voice dismissive. "I don't need any more stories." And with that he hung up, leaving me alone in the deafening silence. My hands trembled as I set down the phone. The door I thought I'd opened had just slammed shut. With nowhere else to go, I threw myself into finding out every detail of Lucas's life I could unearth. I wanted something concrete, irrefutable, that Jerome couldn't dismiss. The bitterness in Jerome's voice had only deepened my resolve. It was clear that Lucas had poisoned him against me completely, and it hurt more than I cared to admit. Later that day, I drove to a bar I'd discovered from one of Lucas's old social media posts. It was a rough place, tucked into an alley near downtown, a spot where he'd spent time with old business partners and shady acquaintances. I figured if Lucas had anything to hide, someone here might know. The bartender, a grizzled man named Pete, seemed reluctant to speak at first, but after I'd slipped him some cash and shared a few words, he began to open up. "You're asking about Lucas?" Pete said, eyeing me skeptically. "He used to be in here a lot, yeah. Real smooth talker, that one." "Did he ever mention anything unusual?" I pressed, leaning in. "Anyone he might have crossed?" Pete shrugged, wiping down the counter. "Only heard bits and pieces. Something about a debt he couldn't shake. Got into some trouble with the wrong folks. Last time I saw him, he was acting real nervous, kept looking over his shoulder like someone was after him." A chill ran down my spine. Lucas hadn't just been manipulating people. He'd been living a life of secrets, lies, and debts he couldn't repay. And now, he'd brought that darkness into our lives. As I left the bar, my mind whirled with questions. What exactly had Lucas dragged us into? And if he was desperate enough to lie about me, what else was he willing to do? That evening, unable to keep away, I drove back to the house. I parked a few houses down, watching as dusk settled over the neighborhood. After nearly an hour, I saw Jerome's car pull into the driveway, followed by Lucas emerging from the house. They stood in the driveway, talking in hushed tones, their body language tense. I rolled down my window slightly, straining to hear. I could make out fragments of their conversation, words that cut through the night air like glass. "You don't understand, Dad," Lucas was saying, his voice low but insistent. "I need your support right now. She's trying to ruin us." Jerome rubbed his temples, looking weary. "This situation is a mess, Lucas. Sylvia told me things I don't want to believe." Lucas's face darkened, a glint of anger flashing in his eyes. "She's lying, just like Eleanor. They're both trying to twist you against me. You can't let them do this." As Jerome's shoulders sagged, I felt a swell of anger. Lucas had him right where he wanted him, wrapped up in guilt, doubt, and fear. I wanted to burst out of the car, confront them both, make Jerome see what was right in front of him. But I held back. Charging into the situation wouldn't make Jerome believe me. I needed more, something undeniable. Over the next few days, an idea took shape in my mind. I remembered Jerome's old tape recorder, tucked away in his study. It was part of a recording system he'd used for city council meetings, a device he rarely touched anymore. If I could record Lucas confessing something, anything, It might be enough to break his hold on Jerome. Late one night, I snuck back to the house, my heart pounding as I crept through the garden and slipped in through the back door. The house was dark, quiet, the air thick with a tense stillness. Moving quickly, I found the recorder in Jerome's study and turned it on, tucking it out of sight on the edge of the desk. I knew it was a gamble, but I was willing to risk anything to expose the truth. Then I waited, hidden in the shadows as the house remained silent. It felt like hours before I finally heard voices, Jerome and Lucas, murmuring in low tones. As they entered the study, I pressed myself into a corner, barely daring to breathe. The conversation started innocently enough, Jerome asking Lucas about finances, about his future plans. But as the discussion deepened, Lucas's tone grew sharper, defensive. "You think I'm a failure, don't you?" Lucas snapped, his voice laced with bitterness. "No, Lucas," Jerome said, his tone weary. "I'm just concerned. Eleanor has a point. You need to be more careful with your choices." There was a pause, a tension hanging heavy in the room. Then Lucas laughed, a low, mirthless sound. "Eleanor's only saying that because she wants to see me gone. She'd do anything to get rid of me." My pulse quickened. This was it, the crack in his facade. "Listen to yourself, Dad," Lucas continued, his voice lowering. "You trust her more than you trust me. But if you only knew what she's done." The conversation trailed off, their voices fading as they moved into another room. But the damage had been done. Lucas had shown his true colors, even if only briefly. As soon as the house was empty the next morning, I slipped back in, retrieved the recorder and played it back, my hands shaking as I listened. Lucas's bitterness, his manipulation, they were all there, captured on tape. I could barely contain the satisfaction rising in my chest. This was my proof, the evidence Jerome would have to believe. I went back to the motel, my mind racing with what I would say. I imagined Jerome's face when he heard the recording, the realization that would finally shatter Lucas's hold over him. For the first time in weeks, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that things might finally change. That evening I called Jerome, my voice steady as I asked him to meet me in person. There was a pause, then a reluctant sigh. "Fine. Tomorrow afternoon, my office." When I hung up, I felt a mixture of nerves and anticipation. Tomorrow, the truth would come out. The next day, I arrived at Jerome's office, the tape recorder in hand, my pulse racing. I dressed carefully, choosing clothes that would convey calm and control, hoping it would lend strength to my words. Jerome looked tired when he met me, his expression guarded. He didn't offer a smile, merely gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "This had better be worth my time, Eleanor." I met his gaze evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "Jerome, I know things between us have been difficult. But you need to hear this. You need to know the truth about Lucas." He sighed, rubbing his temples, but gestured for me to continue. I took a deep breath, then played the recording, watching his face as Lucas's words filled the room. The bitterness, the manipulation, it was all there, laid bare. As the tape ended, Jerome's expression shifted, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. For a moment, he looked like a man finally seeing the world clearly after being lost in the dark. I didn't know," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought." "Lucas has been playing you, Jerome," I said softly. "He's lied to both of us, and he's been lying for a long time." He looked away, shame and anger flickering across his face. Finally, he nodded, his expression resolute. "You're right, Eleanor. It's time I confronted him." The following evening, Jerome summoned Lucas to his study. I wasn't there, but Jerome later recounted it to me in painful detail, the memory still fresh and raw in his mind. Jerome had replayed the recording alone that afternoon, his face set in a mask of grim determination. As Lucas entered the study, Jerome watched him closely, taking in the guarded look in his son's eyes, the defensive posture. "Sit down, Lucas," Jerome said, his voice heavy with the weight of what was to come. He gestured toward the chair across from him, and after a brief hesitation, Lucas obeyed, eyeing his father warily. "What's this about, Dad?" Lucas asked, his tone a forced calm. Jerome took a deep breath, gathering himself. "I want you to listen to something," he said, pressing play on the tape recorder. As Lucas's own words echoed back at him, his expression shifted from confusion to shock, then to anger. When the tape ended, he stared at his father, fury blazing in his eyes. "You're going to believe her over me? Your own son?" Jerome's voice was steady, though his hands trembled slightly. "I'm not choosing sides, Lucas. I'm looking at the facts, and the facts are that you've been lying to me, manipulating me." "Manipulating you?" Lucas scoffed, standing abruptly, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you know everything, don't you? You think you can just judge me without understanding anything." Jerome narrowed his eyes, his own anger simmering. "Then tell me, Lucas, explain it to me." For a moment, Lucas seemed at a loss for words. Then his face twisted into a bitter smile. "Fine. You want the truth? Eleanor was never innocent, Dad. She wanted this, wanted the attention, the thrill. She encouraged it." The words struck Jerome like a physical blow, his face paling as he struggled to process Lucas's claim. That's not possible." "Oh, it's possible, all right," Lucas sneered. "But you're too blind to see it. You've always been too focused on your own life to notice what's happening right under your nose." Jerome felt his composure slipping, rage bubbling beneath the surface. "Enough, Lucas," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You've done enough damage." But Lucas wasn't finished. His voice dropped to a dangerous low, a look of pure defiance in his eyes. "You want me out of the house? Fine, but don't think this is over. You owe me, Dad, and I'll make sure you remember that." Without another word, Lucas stormed out of the study, slamming the door behind him, leaving Jerome alone with a silence heavy with betrayal and regret. The confrontation left Jerome shaken. For days afterward, he withdrew into himself, barely speaking, his mind consumed by the realization of what had happened. The betrayal cut deep, a wound that he could neither fully comprehend nor heal. One evening, Jerome called me. His voice was subdued, his words hesitant. "Eleanor, I think I owe you an apology." I listened, my heart aching with a mix of anger and pity. "You didn't believe me, Jerome," I replied, my voice quiet but firm. "You let him turn you against me." He sighed, a sound filled with exhaustion and regret. "I know, and I'll spend the rest of my life regretting it." For a moment I considered forgiving him. But the hurt ran too deep, the scars too fresh. "I don't know if that's enough," I said softly. "But it's a start." There was a silence, then he spoke again, his voice rough. "Lucas is gone. Left without a word. But I don't think he's done, Eleanor. I feel like he's still holding something over me." The unease in his voice sent a chill down my spine. Lucas was gone, but his shadow lingered, a reminder of the chaos he'd sown. Weeks passed, and I tried to rebuild my life, distancing myself from the wreckage that Lucas had left behind. But just as I began to feel a semblance of peace, a message arrived. It was from Lucas. The message was cryptic, a vague threat wrapped in polite words. "I hope you're well, Eleanor," it read. "I thought we might catch up sometime. After all, we have unfinished business." A knot of dread twisted in my stomach. I hadn't heard from him since he'd left, and now, out of nowhere, he was reaching out? It didn't feel like a coincidence. Later that evening, I shared the message with Jerome. He looked pale, his face lined with worry. "What does he want from us?" he muttered, half to himself. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "But whatever it is, I don't think it's anything good." The days that followed were filled with an uneasy anticipation, a feeling that something terrible was lurking just beyond sight. I began to feel as though I were being watched, catching glimpses of figures in the corner of my vision, only to find nothing there. One evening, as I returned to my motel room, I found the door ajar. My heart raced as I stepped inside, half expecting to find Lucas waiting for me. But the room was empty. Everything as I'd left it, except for one thing. On the bed lay an old photograph of Jerome, Lucas, and me, taken years ago. It was torn down the middle, Lucas's face scratched out. A chill ran down my spine as I held the photo, my hands shaking. This was more than a threat. It was a message, a warning that Lucas wasn't finished with us. He wanted us to suffer, to feel the weight of his presence even in his absence. I called Jerome, my voice shaking as I recounted what I'd found. He listened in silence, his own fear evident in his voice when he finally spoke. "Eleanor, I think we're in more danger than we realized." We knew we couldn't live under Lucas's shadow forever, so Jerome and I began to formulate a plan. We'd contact a lawyer, someone who could help us ensure that Lucas couldn't use any of his manipulations against us legally. We'd also reach out to a private investigator to keep tabs on Lucas, hoping to gather enough evidence to cut him off completely. But just as we were about to put our plan into motion, Lucas resurfaced. It was a cold afternoon when he appeared at Jerome's office. Jerome had been expecting a business associate, so he was completely unprepared when Lucas walked in, a dark grin on his face. "Surprised to see me, Dad?" Lucas said, his tone mocking. "You thought you could just push me out and I'd disappear?" Jerome stood, his fists clenched, his face a mask of barely contained rage. "You have no business here, Lucas. Leave." Lucas laughed, a cold, hollow sound that filled the room. "Oh, I'm not here to stay, Dad. Just wanted to remind you of all the things I know, about you, about your little secrets. It'd be a shame if they came to light." Jerome's resolve faltered, fear flickering in his eyes. "What do you want?" "Simple," Lucas replied, his voice laced with malice. "Everything you owe me, and trust me, I'll make sure I get it." After Lucas left, Jerome called me, his voice trembling. "He's not backing down, Eleanor. He wants everything. Money, control, even our reputation. He's willing to destroy us if he has to." I could hear the fear in his voice, a fear that mirrored my own. Lucas had pushed us to the edge, leaving us with no choice but to fight back. But how could we fight someone who knew every weakness, every secret we'd ever tried to bury? In a moment of desperation, I suggested the unthinkable. "Jerome, what if we went public? Exposed everything ourselves before Lucas has a chance to twist it?" There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I knew the idea was risky, dangerous even, but it was the only way we could reclaim any semblance of control. Finally, Jerome spoke, his voice steady. "You're right. We've been playing by his rules long enough. It's time to turn the tables." Together, Jerome and I crafted a statement, revealing the truth about our relationship with Lucas, his manipulations, and the toll he'd taken on our lives. It was a move born out of desperation, a final attempt to free ourselves from his hold. When we went public, the reaction was immediate. Friends, family, even the media reached out, shocked and curious. And though it was painful to expose our lives so openly, the response brought a sense of liberation, as though a weight had been lifted. But we knew it wouldn't be enough to stop Lucas. We needed more. More than words, more than sympathy. We needed a definitive end. Going public had been like lifting a veil. We felt a temporary reprieve, a brief sense of freedom. With our story out in the open, people began to see Lucas for who he truly was. Close friends offered support, and the community expressed shock and sympathy. Jerome and I finally felt the weight of secrecy lifting, and for the first time there was a glimmer of peace. But the calm didn't last long. As the days went by, I began to sense an undercurrent of danger lurking beneath the surface, as if Lucas was lying in wait, biding his time. Then, one afternoon, I found a note slipped under the door of my motel room. The handwriting was unmistakably Lucas's, a jagged scrawl that sent a chill down my spine. "Did you think you could escape that easily?" the note read. "Enjoy your freedom while it lasts." A surge of fear gripped me, mixed with a creeping realization. Lucas wouldn't stop until he had destroyed everything. This wasn't just about money or power anymore, it was about revenge. His twisted need to make us suffer was far from over. That evening, Jerome and I met at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, hoping to devise a plan that would put an end to Lucas's threats once and for all. Jerome was visibly shaken by the note, his hands trembling slightly as he stirred his coffee. "We can't live like this, Eleanor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "There has to be a way to make him stop." I nodded, feeling the same desperation. "He's already shown us he's willing to go to any lengths. The only way to protect ourselves is to have something over him. Something so damning that he wouldn't dare retaliate." Jerome considered this, his brow furrowed. "Lucas has always been careful. But there might be something. He had a series of failed investments, risky deals. If we could find proof of something illegal, we might be able to use it against him." I wasn't sure where to start, but the idea gave me a renewed sense of hope. If Lucas had indeed crossed legal lines in his past ventures, there could be records, even witnesses, who would be willing to speak out. The next day, I made a call to the private investigator we'd consulted earlier, a sharp-witted man named Harris, who had a knack for uncovering hidden truths. I explained our new plan, urging him to focus on Lucas's past business dealings, particularly anything that might point to fraud or misconduct. "I'll see what I can dig up," Harris replied, his tone cautious. "But it might take a few days. He's a slippery one, that Lucas." While Harris worked on tracking down evidence, Jerome and I resumed our normal lives as best we could, waiting anxiously for news. Days passed without incident, and though the threat of Lucas loomed in the back of our minds, the sense of dread began to dull, replaced by a fragile optimism that maybe, just maybe, we'd finally have the upper hand. Then, 3 days later, Harris called. "I found something," he said, his voice filled with excitement. Lucas was involved in a fraudulent investment scheme. His partners were implicated, but Lucas managed to slip through the cracks until now. I have records, statements, even a few witnesses willing to come forward. Relief flooded through me. With this information, we could finally confront Lucas on our own terms. Jerome and I arranged a meeting with Lucas, choosing a neutral location, a small, private office space downtown, away from prying eyes. The plan was simple: confront him with the evidence, give him a choice to leave us alone or face the legal consequences of his actions. When Lucas arrived, his demeanor was calm, almost casual, as though he had no fear of the position we'd put him in. He glanced between Jerome and me, a smug smile playing on his lips. "So, what's this about?" he asked, his tone dripping with mock curiosity. Jerome took a deep breath, steeling himself. "We know about the fraudulent investments, Lucas. We have evidence, enough to put you in prison if we wanted to." Lucas's face faltered for a split second, a flicker of panic crossing his eyes before he masked it with a cold, calculating look. "You're bluffing," he sneered. "You wouldn't dare." I held up the folder Harris had given us, filled with incriminating documents. "This isn't a bluff, Lucas. We have everything we need to take this to the authorities. But we're giving you a choice. Leave us alone, walk away, and this stays between us." For a moment, Lucas was silent, his eyes darting between the folder and our faces. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, weighing his options, calculating the risks. Finally, he laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "Fine. You win," he said, his voice laced with contempt. "I'll leave you in your pathetic lives, but remember this: you'll never be free of me." "Not really." With that, he stormed out, leaving behind a silence thick with tension and unease. After Lucas's departure, Jerome and I sat in silence, each of us processing the events that had unfolded. The victory felt hollow, tainted by Lucas's parting words, a reminder that his shadow would always linger over us. Over the following weeks, life slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. The threat of Lucas had been neutralized, at least on the surface. But there were scars, invisible yet deep, a constant reminder of the chaos he'd brought into our lives. One evening, as Jerome and I shared a quiet dinner, He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. "I know it's been difficult," he said softly, "but I'm grateful you stayed with me through this." I smiled faintly, the warmth of his hand a comfort. "We've been through worse," I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure if it was true. What Lucas had done had left an indelible mark on us, one that time alone couldn't erase. Just as we began to believe that Lucas had finally disappeared from our lives, a letter arrived in the mail. It was addressed to me, and as I opened it, my hands began to tremble. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the handwriting unmistakable. "Did you really think you could get rid of me so easily?" it read. "This isn't over." The words sent a chill down my spine, a sick realization that our nightmare was far from over. Lucas had no intention of letting us go. He was still out there, still watching, waiting for the next opportunity to strike. I shared the letter with Jerome, his face growing pale as he read the words. "He's taunting us," he whispered, his voice filled with dread. "He's trying to scare us." But it was more than that. Lucas was reminding us that, despite everything we'd done, he still held power over us, an invisible force lurking just beyond reach. With Lucas's threat hanging over us, Jerome and I faced a difficult choice. We could continue to live in fear, constantly looking over our shoulders, or we could take the ultimate step to protect ourselves. The decision weighed heavily on both of us. The thought of cutting ties so completely, so irrevocably. After days of agonizing over our options, we reached a decision. We would leave, sell the house, sever all ties, and start fresh somewhere far away. It was drastic, but it was the only way to truly escape Lucas's reach. Within weeks, we'd sold the house, packed up our belongings, and prepared to leave town. It felt surreal, leaving behind everything we'd built, the life we'd known for so long. But the relief that came with it was undeniable. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace, a glimmer of hope for a future free of fear. As we drove out of town, Jerome reached over, taking my hand in his. "We'll be all right," he said, his voice filled with quiet resolve. "We have each other, and that's all we need." I nodded, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. We'd lost so much, endured so many trials, but we were still standing, still together. As the miles stretched before us, the memories of Lucas began to fade, replaced by the promise of a new beginning, a life untouched by his darkness. If anyone had told me that, at 72, I would find myself sitting here recounting a story of betrayal, longing, and forbidden passion, I would have laughed in their face. At my age, life is supposed to be calm, predictable, and free from the turbulence of youth. I should have been enjoying a quiet retirement with my husband, surrounded by the comforts of a life we had built together over decades. But life, as I've learned, has a way of throwing you curveballs when you least expect them. My name is Margaret, and I've been married to William for over 40 years. He is, by all accounts, a good man, intelligent, hardworking, and loyal. When we were younger, I adored him. His sharp mind and dry wit were endlessly fascinating, and his ambition was inspiring. But as the years went by, the very qualities that drew me to him became the walls that separated us. William was always more comfortable with books than with people, and even after retiring as a history professor, he spent most of his time locked away in his study, writing papers no one asked for and chasing accolades that no longer mattered. Meanwhile, I was left to fill my days alone. I read, tended to our garden, and visited friends when I could, but the emptiness of our house and our marriage was inescapable. We had no children together, though William had a son from his first marriage. Michael. He was a sporadic presence in our lives over the years, charming and affable but always on the move. That changed last spring. Michael, now 38 and recently divorced, arrived at our doorstep with a suitcase and a defeated look in his eyes. He needed a place to stay while he got back on his feet, and William, ever the pragmatist, welcomed him without hesitation. At first, I was glad for the company. Michael was a breath of fresh air in our quiet home, filling it with laughter and conversation. He was kind, attentive, and so very alive. Qualities I hadn't realized I was starving for. But as the weeks turned into months, something shifted between us. The casual camaraderie we shared took on a deeper, more dangerous tone. I never set out to betray William. In fact, I never thought I was capable of such a thing. But the heart is a fickle thing, and mine was desperate for connection, for passion, for something more than the quiet loneliness that had become my life. What happened next was a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, desire, exhilaration, and heartbreak, all culminating in a decision that would change my life forever. If you're willing to listen, I'll tell you everything. Every moment, every mistake, every consequence. Because if nothing else, my story is proof that life never stops surprising you, no matter how old you are. My life with William began like a fairy tale. I was 25 when we met, working as a librarian at the university where he was a young history professor. He was unlike anyone I'd ever known, brilliant, intense, and deeply passionate about his work. I was drawn to him immediately, captivated by his intellect and the quiet confidence he carried himself with. We married 2 years later, and for a long time I thought I had found my happily ever after. William was a man of ambition, always striving for excellence in his field, and I took pride in supporting him. I managed our home, attended his lectures, and hosted dinners for his colleagues, all while continuing my work at the library. It was a busy life, but a fulfilling one. The cracks began to show in the later years of our marriage. As William's career flourished, his attention to me dwindled. He became consumed by his work, spending long hours at the university and even longer hours at home, in his study. I tried to be understanding, telling myself that his dedication was a testament to his brilliance. But as the years passed, it became harder to ignore the growing distance between us. After he retired, I thought things might improve. Without the demands of his job, I hoped we would have more time for each other. But retirement only deepened the divide. William replaced his university office with his home study, spending entire days immersed in research and writing. He was chasing a legacy, he told me, as if the world would forget him if he didn't leave behind one last great work. And so my days were filled with silence. I kept myself busy with gardening, reading, and the occasional visit to friends, but the loneliness was inescapable. The house, once a place of warmth and laughter, had become a tomb, echoing with memories of a life that no longer felt like mine. I often thought about what my life might have been like if I'd made different choices. If I had pursued a career instead of devoting myself to William. If I had insisted on children despite his reluctance. If I had married someone who looked at me the way he once did, with admiration and love. But life doesn't offer do-overs, and so I made peace with the choices I had made. Or at least, I thought I had. Everything changed the day Michael arrived. The rain was coming down in sheets the day Michael showed up at our door. I remember the way he looked, tired, disheveled, and utterly defeated. He was holding a suitcase in one hand and a bottle of whiskey in the other, his usual confidence replaced with something more vulnerable. "Hi, Margaret," he said, forcing a smile. "Is it okay if I come in?" I welcomed him inside, taking his wet coat and offering him a cup of tea. William was in his study, as usual, so it was just the two of us in the kitchen. Over steaming mugs of Earl Grey, Michael explained the reason for his visit. His marriage, he said, had ended in a mess of infidelity and arguments, leaving him emotionally and financially drained. He needed a place to stay while he figured out his next steps. William, when he finally emerged from his study, was surprisingly accommodating. He offered Michael the guest room and assured him he could stay as long as he needed. I was relieved, not only because I wanted to help Michael, but because his presence was a welcome distraction from the monotony of my days. At first, having Michael around was easy. He was charming and affable, always quick with a joke or a kind word. He filled the house with energy and warmth, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations. We talked about books, movies, and his plans for the future. He even joined me in the garden, helping me prune the roses and pull weeds. But as the weeks went on, I began to notice things about Michael that I hadn't before. The way his eyes lingered on me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his smile seemed to brighten whenever I entered the room. And then there were the moments when our hands would brush, small, fleeting touches that sent a jolt of electricity through my body. I tried to dismiss it as nothing more than my imagination, a lonely mind reading too much into innocent gestures. But the truth was, I felt something when I was with Michael. Something I hadn't felt in years. One evening, after William had gone to bed, Michael and I found ourselves alone in the living room. We were sitting on the couch, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about everything and nothing. The conversation took a more personal turn, and before I knew it, I was telling him things I hadn't even admitted to myself. I feel invisible, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Like I'm just existing. Like I'm not even a person anymore. Michael reached out and took my hand. You're not invisible, Margaret, he said, his voice soft but firm. You're incredible, and anyone who can't see that is a fool. I looked into his eyes and saw something there that I hadn't seen in years. Desire. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't imagining things. That night, something shifted between us. Something that could never be undone. Michael's words lingered in my mind long after I went to bed. You're incredible, and anyone who can't see that is a fool. It wasn't just what he said, but the way he said it with such sincerity, such conviction, that it unraveled something inside me. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and replaying the moment over and over. The warmth of his hand on mine, the way his eyes had locked onto mine, as though he could see right through me. For the first time in years, I felt seen, truly seen, and it was intoxicating. The days that followed were filled with a strange tension. Michael and I moved around each other as if caught in an unspoken agreement. We didn't talk about what had happened that night, but the air between us crackled with a kind of electric anticipation. It wasn't long before that tension reached its breaking point. It was a quiet Thursday evening. William had gone to one of his academic society meetings, leaving the house to me and Michael. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he walked in, his hair damp from a shower and his sleeves rolled up, revealing the lean muscles of his forearms. Smells good, he said, leaning against the counter and flashing me that boyish smile of his. Just some pasta? I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He moved closer, standing so close that I could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Can I help? I looked up at him, and for a moment neither of us moved. The air between us felt heavy, charged. And then, before I could stop myself, I said, Michael, what are we doing? His smile faltered, and for a moment I thought he might walk away. But instead he reached out and gently brushed a strand of hair from my face. I don't know, he admitted, but I can't stop thinking about you. My breath caught in my throat. This is wrong, I whispered, though my heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear my own words. Maybe, he said, his voice low. But it doesn't feel wrong. And then he kissed me. At first it was tentative, as though he was afraid I might pull away. But when I didn't, the kiss deepened, growing more urgent, more desperate. I felt his hands on my waist, pulling me closer, and I melted into him, all my fears and doubts drowned out by the sheer intensity of the moment. We didn't make it to the bedroom that first time. It happened right there in the kitchen, the world outside fading into oblivion as we gave in to the passion that had been simmering between us for weeks. After that night, there was no going back. Michael and I fell into a pattern of stolen moments and secret rendezvous. We were careful, always waiting until William was out of the house or locked away in his study. It was risky, and the fear of getting caught only heightened the thrill. But it wasn't just about the physical connection. We talked for hours, sharing our hopes, our fears, our dreams. Michael told me about the pain of his divorce, the ways he felt like a failure, and his fears about starting over. I told him about the loneliness I had been carrying for years, the emptiness that had become my constant companion. With Michael, I felt alive in a way I hadn't in decades. He made me laugh, made me feel desirable, made me believe that I was worth more than the quiet resignation I had settled for in my marriage. But with every moment of joy came an equal measure of guilt. I couldn't look at William without feeling the weight of my betrayal. He had always trusted me implicitly, never questioning my loyalty or my love. And yet, here I was, carrying on an affair with his son under his very roof. I tried to justify it to myself. I told myself that William had pushed me away, that he had made me feel invisible. But deep down, I knew that wasn't an excuse. What I was doing was wrong, and the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore the consequences. The turning point came one evening when William returned home earlier than expected. Michael and I were in the living room, sitting a little too close on the couch, our laughter filling the space between us. The moment William walked through the door, the atmosphere shifted. His eyes flicked between us, suspicion flickering across his face. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice tinged with unease. "Nothing," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "We were just talking." William didn't say anything, but the look he gave me sent a shiver down my spine. After that, things became even more complicated. I started to feel like I was walking a tightrope, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the moment when everything would come crashing down. Michael tried to reassure me, but even he couldn't deny the risks we were taking. "We'll be careful," he said one night as we lay tangled together in the darkness. "No one has to know." But I knew that secrets like ours had a way of coming to light. Secrets have a way of festering, growing heavier with time until they are impossible to carry. For weeks, I lived in a constant state of tension, feeling like a thief stealing moments of joy and passion that didn't belong to me. Every time I looked at William, guilt clawed at me, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. Michael and I had fallen into a dangerous routine of stolen moments. A kiss in the hallway while William was busy in his study, a whispered conversation late at night when William was asleep. It was exhilarating, intoxicating, but also unsustainable. Deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. And then, one evening, it did. William had been invited to give a lecture at the university, a rare event considering he had retired years ago. I had assumed he would be out for most of the night, giving Michael and me a false sense of security. We were in the living room, sitting close together on the couch. Michael had his arm draped over my shoulders, and I was leaning into him, feeling safe in his embrace for the first time in days. "I don't know how much longer we can do this," I said softly, my voice tinged with both longing and dread. Michael's fingers brushed against mine. "I don't want to stop," he said. "I can't stop." Before I could respond, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. Panic surged through me as I leapt to my feet, putting as much distance between Michael and myself as I could manage in those few seconds. But it was too late. William stood in the doorway, his face a mask of confusion and suspicion. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice low but dangerous. "Nothing," I stammered, my heart pounding in my chest. "We were just talking." William's eyes darted between us, narrowing as realization began to dawn. "Talking?" he said, his tone dripping with disbelief. "That's what you call it?" Michael stood, his expression a mixture of guilt and defiance. "Dad, it's not what you think. Don't lie to me." William's voice cracked like a whip, cutting through the room and silencing us both. For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantel. Then, with a shaky breath, William turned to me. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. What could I say? That it had started weeks ago? That I had betrayed him in ways I never thought I was capable of? "It doesn't matter," William said, answering his own question. "You've already said enough." The days that followed were a blur of arguments, accusations, and tears. William confronted me repeatedly, demanding answers to questions I couldn't bear to face. Why? How? Wasn't I happy? Did I ever love him? "I don't know," I told him one night, my voice hoarse from crying. "I don't know why it happened. I felt so alone." "Alone?" he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "You think I wasn't alone too? Do you think I haven't sacrificed things for this marriage?" I had no response. How could I argue with him when I knew he was right? Meanwhile, Michael tried to reach out to me, but I couldn't bring myself to face him. The weight of what we had done was too much to bear. I avoided him at every turn, retreating to my bedroom and locking the door when he was home. Eventually, he made the decision to leave. "I can't stay here anymore," he said one morning, his suitcase packed and waiting by the door. "This isn't fair to any of us." I nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "So am I," he said. And with that, he was gone. William and I were left to pick up the pieces of our shattered marriage. It wasn't easy. The trust we had built over decades was gone, replaced by a chasm of betrayal and resentment. We started seeing a counselor, at William's insistence. At first I was skeptical, but over time, those sessions became a lifeline. They forced us to confront the issues that had been festering in our marriage for years: the emotional distance, the lack of communication, the unspoken disappointments. I felt invisible, I told him during one session, tears streaming down my face. Like I didn't matter to you anymore. William looked at me, his own eyes glistening with unshed tears. And I felt like I was losing you, he said, but I didn't know how to fix it. It was a painful process, but it also brought moments of clarity. We began to see each other not as the perfect partners we had once imagined ourselves to be, but as flawed, vulnerable human beings trying to navigate the complexities of life and love. As for Michael, I didn't hear from him for months after he left. Then one day, I received a letter. "Margaret, I don't know if this will ever reach you, but I felt like I needed to say something. I'm sorry for everything, for the pain I caused, for the mess I made of your life. I never meant for any of this to happen, but I don't regret the time we shared. You made me feel alive again, and for that, I will always be grateful. I've moved to a new city and started a new job. It's not easy, but I'm trying to rebuild. I hope you and Dad can find a way to move forward. You both deserve happiness. Take care of yourself. Michael." I read the letter twice before folding it carefully and tucking it away in a drawer. It was a bittersweet reminder of what had been lost, but also of what I had learned. The months that followed were a time of reflection and rebuilding. William and I continued our counseling sessions, slowly piecing our marriage back together. It wasn't a perfect process. There were setbacks, arguments, and moments of doubt, but we were both committed to trying. One evening, as we sat together in the living room, William reached over and took my hand. "I don't know if we'll ever be the same," he said, "but I want to keep trying. For us." I squeezed his hand, feeling a glimmer of hope. "So do I said. It wasn't the kind of fairy tale ending I had once dreamed of, but it was real, and for that, I was grateful. Looking back, I can't say I'm proud of the choices I made, but I've come to understand them. Loneliness can drive people to do things they never thought they were capable of, and I was no exception. I've learned that love is a complicated, messy thing. It's not always enough to sustain a marriage, and it's not always enough to prevent mistakes. But it can be enough to inspire forgiveness, growth, and a second chance. And for that, I will always be grateful."